Yeah, I always, when teaching this to groups, say it's as easy as 132.
Well, hello and welcome to the Futures Workshop, a new podcast where we talk to the world's leading futures thinkers about tools they've created to help imagine and shape the future. We're coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand. And the podcast is led by Victoria Mulligan, who's a futures practitioner, a futures thinker. She's right next to me. Hello.
Kia ora.
So this is the first episode. Tell us a bit about why you wanted to create the podcast.
Yeah, well, I wanted to create a podcast for people like me, really. I am drawn to the idea of having a broad toolkit of futures tools and methods to choose from so that I can work across different contexts with different groups of people. Marie Conway, and I hope we get to speak to her later in the series, talks a lot about being alert to our own preferences and biases and making sure that the tools and the methods that we select are the most appropriate for the organisations that we're working with, not just the tools that we prefer or that feel most comfortable using. So through the podcast, I wanted to share that there are lots of different approaches to choose from, lots of potential different tools in the toolkit.
Tell me a bit more about the toolkit.
So this toolkit approach has been one that has really helped me, starting with one or two methods, building your expertise in those first, and then starting to introduce a broader range of approaches. And the methods that I'm sharing through this podcast are ones that I use most often, as well as ones that I'm learning to be able to add to my toolkit. Some of them are more foundational, legacy approaches, and some of them will be new to almost everyone listening. And when it comes to futures, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and hopefully this podcast gives more tools to choose from when you need them.
So you've split each weekly topic into 2 episodes. How does that work?
So we have one episode that is the theory of the tool, and we'll get a bit into the history of the tool, how it was created and how it's used. But that second episode will be something a little bit different. So we're learning from some of our futures experts that being able to experience something, particularly a future, either process or product or practice, is really beneficial to how we learn about it and how confident we feel in using it, engaging with it. So we want to try that with some of these tools. So for that second episode, we'll give you the opportunity to experience the tool or the method that's been shared with us by the expert.
So there'll be some people who actually will enjoy just that first episode, learning all the theory, going away and thinking about it and having a go themselves. But for some people actually to almost be in a kind of imaginary or mock kind of facilitation or workshop, that will be when their brain clicks, hopefully, and they get it for the first time.
Yeah, and it's an experiment, right? So it might not work, it might not land, and this might not work for people, and we will can it. But it's worth giving it a shot.
Okay, so we've got 7 topics, 7 weeks, and 2 episodes for each. And of course, 7 experts. Who's first this week?
First is Bill Sharpe. So Bill is an expert in futures and systems thinking and the co-creator of the 3 Horizons framework. Now, this is a model that has been shaping how we think about the future for almost 2 decades. He is currently visiting professor at the Digital Cultures Research Centre at the University of West England, where he researches ways to understand, value and cultural innovation.
And you're going to ask each expert to pick one tool to talk about. What's Bill talking about?
So no surprises here, he's talking about 3 Horizons, the tool that he is most famous for. It's used by futures thinkers from around the world, but it's also popped up in other areas of facilitation and consultancy. So of all of the tools that we cover in this podcast, this one has had the widest reach. So it's awesome to be talking to the person who created it.
And we're about to play your conversation with Bill. What did you enjoy about it?
Well, despite being a rock star in this world, Bill is also very humble. So he has a really lovely way of talking about these concepts. And although I had a good idea of what 3 Horizons was before this chat, the chance to drill down into it for an hour and get some really specific advice and examples from his own practice was a real privilege. So I hope it makes listeners feel like I do, which is that I'm now really excited to try it out again for myself.
Okay, we'll get to hear that in episode 2. But for now, thanks for listening this far and enjoy Victoria's conversation with Bill Sharpe. We'll be back after the interview to chat about what comes next.
Bill Sharpe, welcome to the Futures Workshop. Hello.
Hello, Victoria. Thank you for having me.
So nice to have you here today. Where are we speaking to you from?
I'm in West Wales, in Pembrokeshire, on the North Pembrokeshire coast.
Ah, lovely West Wales.
Can you paint us a bit of a picture, Bill? People will be listening from all over the world.
Well, it is a very ancient part of the world, or known to be just outside. When I walk up the hill, I come to hut circles and remains that have been there since before the pyramids. It's been a place of magic and mystery, as it's known. So it has a very deep history, many layers, and it's lovely to live here because it has a particularly beautiful coastline, the North Pembrokeshire coast. So you really feel you're in touch with the natural world here, the seabirds and the sea creatures. We have a coastal national park here, so it's a very lovely place to live.
So the deep history, good context for thinking about the deep future and the not so deep.
Very, very much so. When I walk up onto the hill, you feel your feet are treading paths that people have trod for millennia, and it just helps you think about different constants of change. This place there used to be more people living there in the past than there are now, so you sort of get a sense of the rise and fall of civilizations and ways of life.
Oh, that's a lovely image you paint. Thank you. Can you tell us today what tool are you going to share, or what futures method are you going to share with us?
Yeah, I'm going to share a framework, a way of thinking about the future called Three Horizons that some colleagues and I have been working on now for quite a long time, nearly 20 years.
Wonderful. I've heard Three Horizons described. Many of us will have heard of it, described as a way of working with change. Maybe if you could start by giving us an overview of the framework and what inspired its development.
Yeah, well, it really is very simple, and that's its great virtue. The clue's in the name, Three Horizons. It's a way of looking at the patterns in the world and how they're changing, as we've just been talking about. So the first horizon is the business as usual, the world as it is today, going on day to day, where we expect today to be much like it was yesterday and tomorrow to be more or less like today. So a predictable world of settled ways of doing things. That's the first horizon. And if we're having a Three Horizons conversation, it's because we have a sense that daily pattern is no longer really fit to the future. And that could be just that it's run out of road, it's sort of failing to keep up with conditions, or that there's this real sense of opportunity, something new turning up. So we're needing to respond to that. So if we're drawing that, we draw that as a line which is dropping away into the future. The third horizon is the futures that we can imagine coming into being to replace the first horizon, the ones that at the moment are only held in our imagination as a picture of that future, but can inform what we're doing today. So we can act today holding in mind a vision of that future world that we want to bring about. And then the second horizon is that messy, turbulent, entrepreneurial space between the first and the third, where we're trying things out, we're stepping into the action, we're taking a chance, we're going for the opportunity and seeing whether we've got a chance of shaping that future in a particular way. And if you've done anything entrepreneurial, you know that sense of having to grasp the opportunity but being very uncertain of the outcome. So those are three different qualities of the future and the present. And the power of Three Horizons is that it replaces a sort of just linear view of time, now, mid-term, long-term, with this sense that we've all got a choice around which horizon we're inhabiting at any moment, whether we're acting to keep things going the way they should be, day to day, a sort of managerial outlook on life, or whether we're acting from a sense of vision and stepping out and standing for something quite different for the third horizon, or whether we're now jumping into the action, trying to shift the system, being somewhat entrepreneurial, ready for the risk, making that sort of commitment. And those three ways of acting towards the future and the present turn out to be something that anybody can connect with. We've now used this tool in many different places and find everybody can really respond to those three ways of looking at the world. And they help us bring together an outward-oriented look, what's going on in the world, make sense of the complexity, begin to map that field of action that we're in, see where we're in it, putting ourselves in the picture. Are we maintaining the current status quo, or are we acting from vision or entrepreneurship? And critically bring all those voices into the room so that we can have a better conversation than we would usually have between the visionaries and the incumbents and the entrepreneurs. So that's its power, a better conversation about the future and change.
And when we need more of them. I'd really like to dig in a little more to each of those horizons, but before we do, can you tell me why you jump from first horizon to third and then back to second when you speak about it?
Yeah, I always, when teaching this to groups, say it's as easy as 1, 3, 2. You usually start with the first horizon, obviously, in order to put down the concerns, to articulate them, bring them fully into view, and just being able to get them visible on the wall chart allows then a certain sense of release. But then you need to move to the third before you look at the second. Because if you just then said, what innovation is going on, you'll come up with things that are probably going to be fairly heavily framed by the first horizon. You don't see them in terms of their full potential. And what we're really trying to do is develop what I call our future consciousness. That's an awareness of the future potential of the present moment. And to do that, you first need to go and say, what might this look like? What visions are we holding? What visions are other people holding? And allow yourself to fully inhabit that future. And then when you've done that, you come back and say, what do we see going on in the second horizon? What growth points are there of the future? And then things will come up, and some of them will be what we call H2 minus. They're innovations, but they're probably going to be captured and used by the first horizon. And others are what we would call H2 plus, which is they really are the growth points of something quite new. And it's well known in the futures field, particularly from work on scenarios, that once you've imagined a future, a possibility, however radical and challenging, it's called cognitive priming. You suddenly notice places where it's growing and happening already. So by moving out to the third horizon and really inhabiting the visions of that future, and then coming back and saying what's already going on, you see it from that sense of potential and possibility in a way you wouldn't otherwise have done.
Fascinating. It feels like the horizons are showing us what's out there. It's making possible futures visible. Is the action, is the how it happens, is that the H2, or is it all the what?
Yeah, it helps to see H2 as where you get into action. That's the step to do that. I mean, it's a little more. You can look at the way somebody might stand for a vision, try and build that vision in a very personal way. Where I live here, the early sustainability movement, self-sufficiency movement really got going in the 70s, and people would come here and live off-grid, live in the woods, live in a very low-impact sort of way. They weren't out there trying to change the whole system, but they were what we call pockets of the future in the present. So we often look for those as we're doing the third horizon and saying, are there some people who are already just trying to be that future, not necessarily trying to change the system, but you can go and learn from them, see instances of parts of it in action. But the second horizon is that very deliberate step into saying, I'm now going to be an entrepreneur. I want to get out there and create this new possibility and gradually build it up and enroll other people in the change. The third horizon, of course, eventually becomes life as normal. It becomes the new H1 once we're there, where that's become the new life as normal, as it might be going from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. Once we're there, that'll be the new life as normal first horizon.
Can we dig a little bit more into that horizon in particular? What else characterizes H1? What else are you seeing? What else are you looking for in that period?
When we're looking at the first horizon, the first question in a workshop will be, what do we see failing? What's the signs of stress, strain and failure? But we also ask what's holding it in place. So what sort of power structures might be in place? Who's at the margins, who's not being heard? And really build up, particularly in many situations, a sense of really seeing what it is that we're going to need to confront in terms of the patterns in play and what's holding them in place. And sometimes it's also helpful for a group to look back and just see, well, what were the defining events that brought this into being? How long ago did this particular pattern get set up? Because that will give us a feel for the timescale of change that might be relevant to the topic. Like in computing, it changes every 10 to 15 years, total change. Our energy system is taking decades to change. It had been in place for a couple of 100 years in its current form. So it helps to tune in to the timescale of change that we're dealing with, so that we know as we look ahead, should we be looking 5 years ahead or 50 or 100 for the sort of changes we're trying to bring about.
Can you talk a little bit about the timescales that you use with Horizons before we move into 3 and 2? What standard? Is there a standard for how far we look out?
Absolutely not. No. As I was saying, you really want to tune into that fairly carefully as you think about facilitating a session by working with the group that you're convening, and just get that sense of what would be a realistic time horizon for this to change. Might it be, if you're working in areas of social attitudes, you might think, well, that's going to be generational. A whole new generation needs to grow up with that, like changes in our eating habits. So maybe the new generation will bring that thing into being. Or it might be technology, and there you've got Moore's law, doubling the power of computing every 18 months to 2 years. And in that field, which is where I used to work, used to reckon that around 8 years was a sort of sweet spot. I found that if you were much closer in, people just were trapped by the current linear trends. And if you went to a decade, just 10 years or beyond, people got a bit unanchored from reality and would just be much too speculative. So that was quite a sweet spot. But then looking at floods and coastal defence and some of those sorts of topics, you might be looking 50 to 100 years out, because the processes of change are going to take that long to unfold, and so you need to tune into that. So at the moment, I tend to anchor things in 2030, 2050 and 2100, because we're trying to halve emissions by 2030. We need to get to net zero by 2050. And it would be wonderful if we could rebuild civilization in a regenerative way by the time we get to 2100. So I find those quite helpful, simple anchors if there isn't anything else that's anchoring the timescale.
That's helpful. And how does it feel to be facilitating a team in H1? So do they find thinking about the current state, about current paradigms and assumptions easy? Is it hard? Is it relatively challenging for them, or is this the easy part?
That's usually a pretty easy part. I mean, if you're having this conversation with a group, it's because they're feeling this sense of a need for change. There's some sense of dissatisfaction with the current way things are. People don't usually find it too difficult to say what's wrong with the world. So no, that isn't usually too difficult.
On that note, can I ask, do they tend to earn negative, or in H1 are we also looking for the things that are going well?
I think there are different stages of a process. You're having this conversation because you want to look at the need for change. So just articulating what is it that's telling us this needs to change, which isn't saying it's all wrong. And there are situations perhaps where I'll come to where that wouldn't be the thing you would do first. So it's only negative in the sense that you're trying to articulate the foundation of why you're having this conversation. And then what's holding it in place can be, that isn't necessarily a negative thing. It might be saying, well, that's what's putting the food on the table. That's what's keeping us alive, putting the lights on. So that isn't a negative statement. It's just an observation that's the fundamental reason we're still doing this, and what might present a sort of challenge. And then later on in the process, when you've done the whole map and you're moving into the next stage of getting into action, you might set up an inquiry saying, okay, that's the vision, but what does the well-intentioned first horizon person say? Says, yes, I see that vision, but there are some things we really need to preserve and bring into the future. a really powerful part of the Three Horizons map when you see it drawn is that the first horizon doesn't disappear. It usually continues across the page into the third horizon, but it's dropped down to it's no longer the center of attention. It's no longer the center of the system. It's bringing in the things we wanted to preserve while letting go of the things that we didn't want. So your point is really well taken. It's not that the first horizon is all wrong. It's just that some of the aspects need to be retired, and new things need to be brought in. And the first horizon is still there, but playing maybe a subservient role to the new system. You could think again in the field of computing back in the day when I was starting, big mainframe computers were what it was all about. And then of course we had personal computers and now smartphones that are a lot more powerful than we had then. So that whole pattern of computing has changed, but we still have the mainframe computers. They've just turned into web servers and data centers. So the old will often still be there, but as part of a bigger vision, a bigger system.
That's very helpful framing. Thank you. Third horizon. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Well, the third horizon is going to come into being from some actions in the present. So it's something we can imagine as a future. We can imagine it coming into being. And the foundation of Three Horizons as its current method was this realization that if we want to talk about the future, people are often very open about their visions. If we say, what evidence do we have of the future? Well, the evidence of the future is the commitments that people are making. So, if Elon Musk says he imagines humans as a multiplanetary species, he's very open about that vision. And you can see that the actions that his company, SpaceX, takes are informed by taking steps towards that. Mm-hmm. So Three Horizons in its current form came into use because of work I was doing with other colleagues on a foresight project, and just this realization that the evidence of the future are the commitments that people make. And so we looked to populate the third horizon, certainly with our own vision, but also what other visions are in play that might be shaping that future, that either we can align with because we could share deeper values with them, or may have to contest because they're trying to bring about a future that we don't want, and we're going to have to challenge that. So you populate the third horizon with the visions that you can see and hold for that future space.
You might be heading this way, Victoria, but can I ask, how do you practically do that in a workshop setting? How does that conversation take place?
Well, this is a critical part of making sure you've sort of set up the process. Again, back to where we started, if you're having this conversation at all, it's because there are some people who want to bring about some sort of future. They're thinking about what that future might be. But I always spend time with whoever is the main convener or sponsor of that conversation, asking them, will the third horizon be in the room, or do we need to do something about that to ensure that we're really bringing in those possibilities in a way that they are actually workable. Three Horizons is not in and of itself a visioning process, and I'm sure in your series you ought to have had people who could talk about good processes for getting people to generate a vision of the future. But it really is important if you haven't got in the room anyone except the first horizon incumbents, and then may be very locked into the current reality and have no interest in change, then you're not going to get very far when you say, what's your vision of the future? What you can do, and I find is usually a very powerful technique, even when people haven't thought about it very much, is to get people to role play other players in the system. And once we've said what's the domain that we're looking at, get people to brainstorm around 20 sort of different players who might, from a perspective of innovation or governance or citizens' action, might be interested, might take a view and might play a part in shaping that future. And then when you're building the third horizon, get them to model and role play how those people would see their vision of the future. So that's a pretty powerful thing, and humans seem to like that sort of creative role play. It enables them to put down their current concerns and simply play out what the world looks like if you're a totally different player in the system. we call it multi-actor mapping as a sort of just way of naming it, just then getting people maybe to build 2 or 3 different maps, each from a different perspective, and then bring those together and see what do they have in common and where do they really diverge. So I found that works pretty well when I want to open up the space, and particularly to pick from, when you've brainstormed those possible actors, to get them to vote and pick a few who would be most interesting and perhaps most radical. And that's it's sort of like a scenario technique for generating a really divergent and rich picture of the third horizon.
Bill, you used the word domain there, and other guests have used that word, and I'm really regretting not getting somebody to define it earlier for people who aren't familiar with all of this terminology. What are you referring to when you use that word domain?
Oh, just the area of interest. I think that was how. I can't remember exactly what I said. A domain just means what's your area of interest, what's your domain of interest. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. Sorry.
And Bill, while we're talking about the facilitation of this method, how big are the groups that you're doing this with to make it most successful?
Well, I think you get critical breakpoints in your facilitation approach and method as you go through different numbers in the room. These are quite general facilitation things. I don't think they're peculiar to Three Horizons in my experience. So up to about 6 people can have a very rich conversation on anything, because everyone's voice can come and go with a great deal of freedom. You don't need to manage that too much. Then up to about 10 or 12 people, if as a facilitator you can keep a dialogue going for quite a time, ensuring that every voice does get heard, but the quieter voices are beginning to hold back because there isn't time for everyone to get the same airtime. So you have to hold that space quite carefully. But that's my preferred sweet spot. 10 or 12 people, where as a facilitator you can really deepen the conversation and hold the process and have occasional little breakouts to release more energy. Then from 10 on up to 20 and beyond, you really have to think about setting up breakout groups where more of the work could be done. And that has the downside that they've got to a large extent self-facilitate, and they might not be as good as you would like at that. And you've also got to think about the process for reintegrating the contributions from the groups. So that can take you up to 20 or 25. If you're going to go beyond that, and I was part of a process where we had a conference on transformations, and we facilitated Three Horizons for all 300 participants through an afternoon. But we had a team, I think there were 10, or we had a team where each facilitator was taking a room of 30 people and getting those to work in groups. But then we had that facilitation team to help drive those breakout sessions and reintegrate. So I'd say, as you get bigger, you've just got to build up the team so that you can repeat that level of organisation in smaller groups. But my favourite is working with no more than about a dozen people, where you can really, who are all really involved in the topic. But what I'm finding is we've moved from where the main focus of this sort of work is primarily organisational to where it's bringing multiple people together from different perspectives. So you nearly always find you've got at least 25 people in the room, and so you need to organise in breakouts and make the task something that the group can do, and then maybe poll to gather in information, maybe get people into trios and treat each trio like a sort of virtual person and things like that.
While we're here, and if I may get granular, Three Horizons is a beautifully visual tool, and being audio, we don't have it up, but we will have access to it through the show notes. When you're facilitating, you have this somewhere they can see. Are you using physical assets? Do you have post-it notes? How are you making this real? How are you bringing this to life?
This is absolutely best done through visual facilitation, which is the term I learned from my colleague Tony Hodgson, who was really founder and pioneer of this work. And in visual facilitation, as a facilitator, you take real care in capturing individual points from people. and then putting them up on a post-it note, or ideally hexagon notes are even better, because then you've got more power in terms of clustering them. And if you adopt this really disciplined approach to distilling each individual point, then you can build up a much more powerful space for group thinking. A group can hold and work with 20, 30 individual items in a way that's simply impossible if you're just talking and brainstorming. So we've got a lot of online resources I can point your listeners to afterwards. We've built up an online resource library of facilitation tools and methods, and there we introduce the foundation of visual facilitation. In the days when we used to run workshops in person instead of online, we'd take nearly a whole day just on this basic capture. We used to joke, we're going to take a whole day to teach you how to write a post-it note. But that was quite a serious point, is that there's quite a lot of facilitation practice in listening very deeply, capturing each point. That creates a space where everyone's completely heard, and then releases that point into the shared space. And then the whole group of, as you've got 20, 30 people, can work with a very rich visual space, and cluster things and into different modes to go from one method to another. So you can create an overall process where the material is carried through multiple steps in a much richer way than you could do in any other approach. So yeah,
it's wonderful.
visual facilitation is really a foundational practice, which isn't just particular to Three Horizons. It's for a whole range of different approaches to setting up a field of shared work for people. So that's not particular to Three Horizons. It's a foundational facilitation technique.
And makes it all the stronger.
Yeah.
So you've described H2 as a transition zone, I think you said. Tell me more about this horizon.
Maybe a simple way in is just to look at the way we organise investment in the world in terms of these three horizons. So, in the first horizon, you've got the established companies of the stock market, and that's where the pension funds can put their money. You expect predictable performance and certain, standards of reporting and governance. That's the first horizon. The second horizon is inhabited by the venture capitalists. And if you're a venture capitalist, you know that, I heard numbers years ago, I don't know how accurate they are, but, if you've got 21 investments, a third of them are just going to not work. You're going to lose your investment. It didn't turn out right. Maybe a third of them will make a bit of money. They'll wash their own face. Not a great thing, but, it was okay. A third of them do really well, and you really get your returns for your fund out of that. And if you're very lucky, one of them turns into the next Apple, Intel, or whatever. So the nature of the second horizon is that you can't completely predict which things are going to win out and which aren't, and some of it will just be happenstance and accident. So you have to sort of play the numbers. And then in the third horizon, we have research councils and universities that can take a long-term view, where the whole mode of investment is maybe more formative. Again, just making groundbreaking work, but without necessarily the move to really the entrepreneurial stage of beginning to exploit things. And of course, over the last few decades, a lot of work has been done to set up mechanisms to translate the groundbreaking work into the entrepreneurial opportunities. So that's a way of looking at the second horizon as this inherently risky transitional space which is opening up between the first horizon that we've got and the third horizon we haven't got yet. And you exit the third horizon as some choices, we settle down on them and move ahead. An example would be, electric vehicles, where a decade ago, it wasn't at all clear would we use fuel cells, would we use batteries? And, that's more or less settled down that for consumer cars, it's going to be batteries. So something that was very uncertain, with people investing in all the alternatives, gradually narrows down until we know, okay, we're going down this path, let's build that out. That becomes the future. So we sometimes talk of three phases: envisioning, building up a vision of what that future might be. Then this enrolling stage where people compete to be the future, and once that competition is more or less over, then the resources can move in and build out and that new future.
And in that horizon, and maybe I'm just repeating what you're saying here, but it feels like you're saying, if we were to look at this diagram on the left, you've got the activities that are closer to H1, and on the right, the activities that are closer to H3.
Yeah.
And it's the idea that we are moving through that left to right.
Yes. Yeah. So Three Horizons combines this sense of three ways in the present we're acting towards the future, but also a journey. And the journey is there's a point where H1 is giving way and the new is really coming into being, but it hasn't quite settled down yet. So there's competition and uncertainty in what's really going to be the future. And then eventually that settles down. And you can play around with the diagram and sort of explore different ways it might turn out. Like you can get a sort of massive overshoot in the second horizon. I lived through that in the 2000-2001 dot-com boom, when everyone piled in, huge amounts of money went in, but it wasn't all very well allocated. So there was a huge crash after the boom because the money wasn't producing all the results. It was over invested. So there was sort of a peak in the second horizon, and then it dropped right down to nothing for a year or so, and then gradually built up again. And you might see something a bit similar possibly with the current AI boom, is that a lot of money is pouring in there. It can't all produce the returns everyone's hoping it'll produce. So, there's going to be some recalibration, and then the main developments will become clear and will gradually build up and over time get firmly established.
And Three Horizons has been around for a while. I don't think there'll be too many futurists that haven't heard its name. Has it changed over time, or has it been pretty solid and unchanging?
It hasn't fundamentally changed, and that's why I've been getting it out there a lot over time. Is that the basic idea is so simple? There are three patterns. Today is the future, and a bit in the middle. That's pretty easy to observe, and people connect with it very directly. So, in a fundamental way, it hasn't changed at all. In terms of enriching, just understanding sort of some of the depth of the practice, obviously we've been bringing in many other elements as time has gone on. So it's more a process of development and enriching the other tools that can be used with it, and ways to use it that it's developed. No, the fundamental model has stayed very constant.
And I'd like to get back to some of those tools that you find helpful to use with it. But one interesting thing that you've sort of pointed to is the fact that it is quite a nice entry point into thinking about futures. Can you expand a little on that for me?
One of the groups that adopted it quite quickly here in Wales, in 2015 asked what's known as the Future Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, a requirement for all policy to be evaluated and tested against its impact on future generations. And there's a commissioner, Future Generation Commissioner's Office. And some years ago, I went to visit them with my colleague Graham Lester, a co-inventor and pioneer of Three Horizons, and we talked about how they might use futures tools in their work and introduce Three Horizons. And they hadn't got any futures practice at that time, but they had hired someone to be their futures person, and she just picked up our resources, picked up the method, and really ran with it, with very, very little support from us. So that was a wonderful instance of just picking up the tool and using it, and adapting it into their own requirements. I'm sorry, I've somewhat lost track of the question that you asked.
Well, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Really, it's easy. It's an easy tool to run with, and it's one thing I think for a futures commissioner to be able to pick it up and do some policy work with it. But equally, I mean, we were talking pre-show chat about, you can draw this on the beach with your
Yeah.
kids and look at what it means for the future and what we see now and what we see maybe 10 years down the track.
Yeah, and what they found in that usage was it can just become, you don't always have to get up and draw it on the wall, but having an awareness of this way of thinking is very useful in all sorts of contexts. It can just help you have a better conversation with somebody who's thinking about change. And then you might say, oh, how about thinking about it in this way? So it creates a shorthand. Once people have heard this language of the three horizons and H2 plus and minus, they don't generally forget it. It just becomes a very natural way and starts to enter the conversation. And that's what we've seen. That's what they particularly reported back from the Future Generations Office. It just helped them have better conversations, even if you weren't running any sort of formal process.
Now, those are the strengths. Those are the things that make it as wonderful as it is. But where are their challenges as a facilitator? Is there a part of this process that is difficult to move people through? Is there a part of the process that people find really hard to connect with and you need to lean into a little more?
Not generally. I never hit any particular problem other than this one we talked about earlier, which is really in preparation, asking the question, have we understood broadly the scope of what it is we're trying to look at? Is that clear? Have we got a sense of the area that we've got to work on? But you can, that's not a big problem. You just have to make sure you've got clarity on that. But then critically, will we have the third horizon in the room? Why do we think there's going to be any change in this area? What do you know about that? Will we have a good discussion? Will we have a rich enough discussion? Have you done enough work or done enough preparation for the material that will come into the room? And then critically, you do have to think in advance about the relationship to the first horizon and the people who represent it. So I suppose one of the biggest questions I get asked is, how do you shift the first horizon if the incumbents are really dug in and resisting change and maybe actually trying to prevent it and undermine it? And then you've really got to ask the question of when is the right moment and the right mode to engage the third horizon. It's important to recognise we say there are never H1, H2, H3 people. We all have all three in our repertoire and ways we behave day to day in different situations. But you've got to think about in the area you're looking at, how are people going to turn up? Who are the incumbents? Are they going to turn up recognising that there's a need for change, or with an agenda of just keeping a watching brief and trying to impede change? And so if you misjudge that or don't understand how those power politics are going to play out, then it might go wrong or not work very well. Equally, if you haven't got the third horizon in the room in such a way that it's actually workable, that people know enough about the topic to actually work on it, then it's not going to be very creative. It's going to be a bit flat. But sometimes, if you're aware of those things, then you may just use the first meeting might just be revealing where the group is on those and their need to go away and do more work on the third horizon, or to think of a different way of how they're going to engage and bring the first horizon into the room. So there are things to think about.
How do we know what we're bringing, Bill? So I'm in a Three Horizons workshop and I don't know if I'm an H1, H2 or H3. How do you get there? And I don't know if you can answer that, but I do. It does make me wonder. How do I know that I'm not the H1 with my heels dug in rather than the H3?
Well, I suppose we find people naturally tend to locate themselves and their response where they are on the map. So that doesn't seem to arise itself as a problem. And going back to we've got all three voices, and it's a way actually we often start a workshop because it's also quite fun. Is first I usually ask, has anyone been in the situation of being a visionary talking to an incumbent? And somebody in the room say yes, and you say, well, how did that go? What did they think of you? And they'll say, oh, they thought I was naive or silly or unrealistic and all these sort of negative things. And then I say, yeah, what did you think of them? And they'll say, "Oh, I thought they were a dinosaur and stuck in the mud and didn't really understand the future." So we really have a bit of, that's a very lively conversation usually. And then we talk about, and how was it with the entrepreneur? And we unpack that a bit. So just bring into the room the way these voices actually turn up, and have a little bit of discussion about that. And then if you've got time, put people into a group, and maybe just explore how are these voices turning up in your life. Which role did you play in that conversation? Think about a time when they've turned up, either professional, personal life, and think about, oh, there I was playing the visionary, but with so-and-so, I always have to be the voice of realism and the first horizon. And if you've got even more time, you can set it up as a role play, and get people to inhabit the different horizons. And people always just have a lot of fun being the negative mindset, just where you just think you're right. And then when you say, now do the positive voices, and we give them some briefing on that, and people get a bit more serious and into it. But it's great to see how people get a lot more fun playing the negative voices. So that's a very good warm up. So it just allows people to see, these really are how we humans engage in conversations, and how the first and third horizons talk straight past one another most of the time and tend to polarize even more and more. But so we talk about moving from mindsets to perspectives and being able to see them as three voices that we've all got. So if you do something like that, then people are much more aware of where they're coming from and where the other voices in the system are coming from. And it's important as you transition through the process from H1 to H3 to H2 to create a little space to allow people to sort of mentally reorient themselves, particularly stepping into the third horizon to be creative. Lots of facilitation experience on how to move people into a more creative space. So there's lots of just sort of standard facilitation stuff in here.
Bill, we're closing in on time. Before we lose you, I am interested to know if there are other tools, futures tools, foresight tools, or otherwise that perhaps support or complement the framework.
Yes, certainly. I think one of the most powerful additional tools we've found is what's called dilemma thinking. It was pioneered by Charles Hampden Turner, a management thinker and practitioner. And it helps you take pairs of values that are really polarized and then bring them into a more creative resolution. So instead of people pulling apart and fighting ever more vigorously about their competing values, you can put them into a space where they see that unless you respect both values in a more generative and creative way, you're not going to get what you want. So as it might be between directive policy and free market mechanisms. And dilemma thinking helps you see that if one side gets what they want, in the long term they don't get what they want. That these two values are intrinsically related to each other in a deeper way. And so it's a bit like sailing, that you've got to work with the wind and the tides. If you let go of the keel, then the wind's going to take you off. And if you don't manage the sails, then you're just going to go where the tides want you to go. So realizing that the very condition of progress is that you hold these two in a creative resolution in the moment.
That has extra resonance in 2024, doesn't it? I mean, you apply that to all sorts of disputes and dilemmas.
Yeah. And our colleagues in the TED organisation have been running a series of dilemma workshops looking at different issues in the transition we need to make societally, and finding dilemma thinking is a really helpful and powerful tool for looking at competing values on the journey and competing values in the third horizon. And we characterise it as turning argument into action. So that's a very powerful tool, and a number of ways you can use it with three horizons.
We'll try and dig further into that one. Do you use that to prime three horizons, or is that something you would use after?
No, use it later. And the most obvious way to use it is what we were talking about earlier. What does the well-intentioned first horizon say? So once you've articulated the transition between H1 and H3, you can set that up as a dilemma between holding on to what we've got, a sort of rock-like value. We must maintain the success of what we've currently got and not let that go. And what we would call the river value, the need to adapt and change and move to this new vision. And then you start to set up, well, okay, what does each one offer into the resolution, the generative resolution space? And then how might we creatively combine those different offers from the two sides into something that's more flexible and generative as we go down that path.
Fascinating. Bill, before we head away, can you give some advice for futures practitioners who haven't yet played with the Three Horizons framework and might like to? Where should they start?
They could start just by watching one or two of our introductory videos that we've got on the Future Stewards website. I'm sure you can put those links out there.
For sure.
Very simple introduction to all the things we've been talking about. And then there are many online resources that we've made available. So I'd say look at the introductory resources and just go and have a Three Horizons conversation with somebody. It really is that easy. It's a very gentle entry point. There's nothing mysterious about it. You don't need to be an expert in futures. You don't need to be an expert in anything really except maybe knowing what it is you're talking about. And Three Horizons will help you have a better conversation.
Bill, it's been great to chat. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Victoria. It's been a pleasure.
So that was such a fun, interesting conversation with Bill Sharpe. I really enjoyed it. One thing that really stood out to me was how he described Three Horizons as always existing in that present moment. I think it really changes how we think about the future.
Right, that's that idea about future consciousness.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It lets us see the potential of futures and what we're doing right now and how our current actions are directly influencing those future possibilities. I think the framework's making it really clear that the future isn't some distant concept, but rather something that's unfolding through our present behaviours, and that perspective's pretty critical for making sure that we're making decisions that align with our long-term goals.
Can you, when you were talking to him, can you imagine using that with a group?
Yeah, I think at its best, using the model as a group helps us get a shared understanding of our problems, of the future that we desire and how to get there. I think at worst, you're flagging up differences in opinion about the status quo, or what initiatives are best to achieve change. And even that's helpful when you're thinking about the ideal future that you want to be working toward.
Anything else stand out from that conversation?
Yeah, I loved hearing his reminder that all of the three voices are likely to be found in every meeting room we walk into, but even more interesting, within ourselves. So we might find ourselves drawn to a particular mindset, whether it's H1, 2 or 3, because of the role that we're in, or if we're torn between different voices at the same time or in different circumstances. And maybe those voices that we have clash, but by better understanding the perspectives they bring, it's possible to have more positive conversations and make sure that our future needs are factored into today's decisions.
And do you think that the clash or possible tensions, internal tensions or between group members might actually stop you getting where you need to go by the end of the session?
It's interesting. I think in the end it's got to be process over product, right? Not to take away from the product, but the value of this, I think, is in the quality of the conversations it provokes.
Great. Well, thank you again to Bill for his time, and you get to hear Victoria using Three Horizons in a workshop setting in our next episode, which is due to drop Sunday New Zealand time. So that's going to be a super fun party Saturday night in store for anyone listening in the Northern Hemisphere. Download a new podcast. After that, in episode 3, we'll be diving into a new tool, causal layered analysis, with the great Sahal Anayatella. That episode will come out this time next week.
Thanks for listening to the Futures Workshop. Tell your Futures friends. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on the episode and what we've discussed.